Hello and welcome to this installment in our Slate demo series, using retention policies to delete or purge data in Slate. My name is Adam Horton, and I will be your presenter. I am a Slate admissions implementation strategist here at Carnegie. Been working in higher education for 20 years and was a former Slate captain for 7 years prior to joining Carnegie in 2023. And my persona is the inquisitive and attentive guardian. Our goal for today will be to learn how to create, configure, and execute a retention policy to permanently delete data in Slate. Our agenda will be to first answer the question, what is a retention policy? And then to give some guidance for developing retention policies. Finally, a demo in our test environment where we will create, configure, and execute a retention policy together. So, what is a retention policy? Well, by default, Slate retains all of the data that's stored there in perpetuity. But a retention policy and a retention policy tool in Slate is what can be used to permanently delete some data or to purge specific data at appropriate times. There may be data that you have in your instance that you need to delete daily or weekly or annually or even an ad hoc basis. And the retention policy tool is what you'll use to do that. Retention policies are also most often used to comply with state or federal laws, such as the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, better known as FERPA, which many of us are very familiar with. Or there may be some institutional or campus data retention policies that exist that are very specific to your college or university that you need to follow and comply with. You can also use a retention policy to make sure that you're in compliance with those. Or you may need to perform a batch deletion for some erroneous data that was imported into your Slate instance. And so you can use a retention policy to clean up that data. That way you can import it again through upload data set correctly and make sure that that data is accurate and correct in your Slate environment. So how do we develop retention policies? Well, before we even start building anything in Slate, it is best and strongly advised to consult and collaborate, to have conversation with additional stakeholders on your campus, just to ensure that all the legal and institutional guidelines are being followed correctly, specifically regarding FERPA data and or other state or federal laws that need to be in compliance with. These stakeholder groups can include your general counsel's office, your office of institutional research, your registrar, IT, financial aid, really any group that has a vested interest in the data, making sure the data is treated correctly and that all these guidelines are being followed correctly as well. Some other things to keep in mind is that Slate is not really designed to be a data warehouse, and so it's pretty common that data would need to be cleaned up in your Slate environment to make sure it's running correctly, it's running efficiently, and so there may be times where you need to export some data out of Slate and store that in a data warehouse, and then you could purge that data from Slate because it's backed up there. Our recommendation as we build these retention policies is to build them in production, in your production environment, but then to refresh your test environment and run these policies there in the test environment first, just to ensure that the correct data is being deleted, that the retention policy is running as you would expect it to run, and then make that change in production once you've been able to test it in your test environment. Having the prerequisite knowledge in building queries and rules using configurable joins is really necessary before building a retention policy. As we'll see shortly, as we build a retention policy together, you'll notice that we have to have a pretty strong understanding of using configurable joins and filtering to ensure that we're actually getting and isolating the data that we do need to remove by running a retention policy. Lastly, we would recommend that the permission to execute a retention policy should be a very limited permission to users in your instance. Because we are deleting data permanently, we want to make sure that only those who really should be doing this have access to do so. So make sure that this permission is only granted to those who really need that access. So now we're going to step over to our demo environment. We're going to create, configure, and execute a retention policy together. So I'll jump over here to our Slate demo training showcase here. I'm here in our database area here, which you can navigate here by clicking on this gear icon to go to database. And then you'll notice that our retention policies are located here in the auditing section. You could, of course, search for the retention policies here in the search tool as well. But we'll go ahead and click on retention policies here to open up our retention policy editor. A few things you'll notice here right off is that there are some instructions and some warnings here as well. That the retention policy editor provides this self-service management to kind of automate retention policies within Slate. That way, this data can be cleaned up on an ongoing basis or purged on an ongoing basis, but also a warning that with great power comes great responsibility and to proceed with caution. Because again, as I've mentioned before, we are going to be deleting data permanently from Slate by running retention policies. So we want to make sure that we are doing this very carefully because the data will be lost if we do it incorrectly. A few things you'll also notice here, very similar to other areas within Slate. Over on our left-hand navigation, we do have the ability to click on our active or inactive statuses here to see those retention policy groups that are either currently active or that are inactive, or all statuses. We also have the ability to keep things well organized using a folder structure here in our retention policies. And we also have the ability to use a customized view here if we need to add some additional columns here to view additional data points here as well. And if we did have a really long list of retention policies, we could even use the search tool to find the specific group of policies that we need to find. So as we begin to build this together, we will need to create a new group first. Retention policies are always created in a group. Oftentimes, a retention policy group is needed when we are deleting data related to applicants because we may want to delete all information related to that applicant. And so we will need to do that sort of part by part, deleting first the application related data and then later the person data. And so we want to run these policies in an order. And so we would put those in a group. So we'll click on the new group button. And then we will give this group a name. And for our demonstration purposes today, we are going to be getting rid of some prospect data. We'll go ahead and make our group active. This will ensure that we can go ahead and build some policies there. This doesn't really do anything to execute policies, so don't worry about that. And then we can create a folder for our prospects as well and keep our retention policies all organized there in our folder structure. And so once we have our group created, we can then begin to create either a policy if it's just going to be one policy that needs to be run, or a series of policies that will run in order. To do so, we will need to create the policy by clicking on this new policy link. And then we will get a pop-up where we need to give a name to this policy. For our purposes here, we want to delete some old prospect data that we no longer need here in our instance. And so we're going to take some data from our prospects prior to 2019. So all of those entry terms that a person may have selected from before 2019, we're going to include those in our query here. The next point here we have is an object type, and this is going to be the type of data that we need to delete. And as you can see, we have a decent list here of all the different types of data that we can delete here within a retention policy editor. It can be record data, such as an application or certain address information or rows on our entity tables, or it could be form responses, specific materials that are no longer needed. And it could be school data as well as a test score data or other things. We also have the ability to delete database objects, these being things that are built in Slate, like a specific field that was created that was never used. We could delete that using a retention policy. We could also delete materials, the types of materials or test types as well. But for our purposes here, we're going to choose record because we're going to be deleting person records here in Slate. So that's the object type. And then we are presented with a base. So if you are already very familiar with building things in configurable joins, you'll know that choosing a base is very important. It's very important here for our retention policy editor as well. And we are limited to just the person base here when we choose a record. With other selections for our object type, we can have other bases as well. and then it's part of this group that we set up. And then our order, we have to give it an order. We're just going to have one policy here in this group, so we'll make this number one. And then lastly, we have a fail threshold, and this will be the number. If our query exceeds this number, then that policy will not run. It will cancel. No data will be deleted. And so we want to set a fail threshold of a number that should be no more than what we would expect. And so I know here in our test we will have no more than 500 records that need to be deleted. Lastly, you'll notice that we do have status here that we can't change. It's inactive, and this is by default, just to ensure that we're not, accidentally going to go ahead and run an active retention policy upon creation. So we can go ahead and save that retention policy there. And that will take us to our editor here, where we can then begin to filter on the data that we actually need to be removed from Slate. And so in our example here, we want to get rid of our prospects prior to 2019. We will choose a filter. We want our status to be chosen with our person status, because we're just looking at those who are at a status of prospect. No applicants, no inquiries, no one else. And so we can select our prospects there. And then our other stipulation is those that are prior to 2019. So we want to choose an entry term here in our other filter. And select all those terms that are prior to 2019. So anything that's from 2017 or 2016, 2018, we want to include all of these terms in our query here. So we'll save that. And now we're down to about 300 records here, matching rows, 300 person records who are prospects who have an entry term prior to 2019. Once we've done all our filtering, we can set the action of the retention policy that we need to run. And we get a couple options here. We can delete the entire row, which would be what we want to do in this case. We want to delete that entire person record from our Slate database. We could also choose a specific value, but retain the row. So this would keep the person record in this instance, but would delete specific data points on that person record, such as, an external ID perhaps, or a social security number. If we only wanted to get rid of very specific data points related to that person record, we could, rather than the entire record itself. But as I said, we're going to just delete that entire person record here. And then again, I want to hit save. Again, no risk of accidentally activating and running this retention policy, because it is defaulting to that status of inactive, which we see here. But if we have reviewed it and we're ready to go ahead and run that retention policy, all we need to do is open up that same policy we just built, go to our edit button, and then change our status now from inactive to active. Click save, and then we can navigate back to our list here, and we will see that it is now active. And we now have an execute button, which we did not have before. Since our policy here within this group is now active, we could execute this policy. And so we want to do that. And so we could do that. We could click the execute button. We also have some other options here. Also, if we wanted to run the options, if we wanted to enable that to happen on an ongoing basis, maybe it's nightly, once a week or several times a week that we need to run this policy. We can check off these days of the week that we want it to run, and we can make that automated. We are not required to, though. We can run these on an ad hoc basis. And so in this case, we do want to run this on an ad hoc basis. So I want to click this execute button. And then we're going to be required to type a memo here. So we want to delete prospects prior to 2019 and click the execute button. And then again, as just one final fail-safe to make sure we actually do want to delete and permanently delete this data, we need to type the word execute in all caps, and then click OK to actually execute this policy. It will take just a minute for this policy to run, and then we will be able to see that our count no longer is at 300, that it is now at 0 once this policy completes, and we refresh our page here. we will see that that count now went down to zero. No records meet that criteria any longer. And we can now see that even if we open up our query, we no longer have any matching records either. And so that is how we run a retention policy. Thank you so much for joining me today in this demo series video on retention policies in Slate. If you have additional questions, you can always reach out to us at carnegiehighered.com. Thanks.